I'm Phil Jones, Chief Congressional Correspondent for CBS News. Little did I know way back in 1955 when I had these senior corduroys painted with a CBS microphone on it that I really would be standing here at the United States Capitol one day paying tribute to my speech and drama teacher. Back in '55 when all the pictures were taken, we were here on our senior trip going to the big cities, Washington and New York. And as I stood here, I remember thinking, someday I want to be here. I'd like to be broadcasting out of here. I'd like to be with a network. Those were big dreams for a little kid who lived on a farm outside Fairmount, Indiana. But one reason I had all of this confidence was because of a drama and speech teacher. She had taught all of us to have confidence, to go for what we wanted. She was located in a room on top of the third floor of Fairmount High School. And if you walked around through the corridors, it would take you on to the high school stage. But before you ever got on that stage, she had looked you over, worked with you, and managed to bring out every little bit of talent in your body and soul. Well, anybody from Fairmount High School could go on telling stories about this teacher, about how she made James Dean everything that he was, and most of the rest of us, she had an impact. But we probably couldn't tell these stories as well as she can. So this is one of those rare occasions where a student actually gets to cue his teacher. So without further ado, it is my privilege and high honor to introduce my former drama and speech teacher, my friend, my inspiration, Adeline Nall. Adeline, you're on.
This is May the 27th, 1986, and Maxine Rowland, I can't tell you thank you enough for this lovely flower from the James Dean, we remember James Dean International Club, fan club.
You're welcome.
Bless Sylvia and you. And here we are at the entrance of Fairmount High School. After 30 years of my life spent in this building, there are many tender memories I have here. And this door, we have so many beautiful, beautiful memories of this entrance. And if you look upstairs, you can see my windows. The 5 windows upstairs are to the room 21. We're going to scoot up in the tower, right straight up the tower. There are a few people here that are very interesting to have in our group. Hugh Cahill, who was Jim's biology teacher, Peg Gann Richards, who was my star pupil for 4 years and now teaches at Madison Grant, speech and drama, and Maxine Rowland from Ohio, and Alan and Diane Absher, and of course we can't forget our producer. Come on, Hugh, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
Oh, you
And
might
that's Steve.
Next, Peggy. Peggy Gann was 4 years my pupil, and how well I remember you in the freshman year.
Oh, yes, and because of you, I decided to go into teaching speech and theater because I couldn't be a James Dean. At least I could be an Adeline Nall. That was
Bless
my
your
intention.
heart, that's sweet. And Diane and, what's his next name? Alan Absher. My goodness, how many years you've been coming here. You are real fans of Jim Dean, aren't you? Here you are.
Yes. I don't know where
Where do you live?
We live in Spencer, Indiana.
Oh, I said Ohio.
No,
No.
Indiana.
Indiana.
Good. Well, that's wonderful. And then Maxine and Nan. Maxine Rollins. Where are you from, my dear?
I'm from Xenia, Ohio.
That's quite a trip. And now our producer, Tom Burgess.
From Freeland, Michigan, a small town near Saginaw.
Well, it's due to you that we are here today. Thank you, sir. Well, here we are in the old gym of Fairmount High School. It's hard to believe that this was a famous gymnasium where so many years we won lots of tournaments. The gym entrance is over there, and of course the basket that he used to shoot basketball, and Mike Kirkpatrick and all the other O.H. Rigsby and all the other ball club members would shoot their baskets here. But one reason that I wanted to come into this old gym, well, it's got a lot of sentiment. We're trying to save the stage and the court upstairs, which is the former gym before this was ever built. But this has memories in addition to just the basketball, because as far as Jim Dean is concerned, when he was a senior in 1949, 48 and 49, in speech class, we bought a wire recorder, which was the best we could get then. And you understand that, Peg, the value of a tape recorder. So we brought the wire recorder down here. There was a balcony, and there was a ledge right inside this door. You can almost see where the door was, right where the clock is, the entrance to this gym, and that was where the man sat to sell tickets, that window. Then the ledge came along here someplace from the door, and Jim sat right over here and broadcast the second team game. And I remember how excited he was. Here they go, you know, down the floor, and he had a big time, just as if it were the real McCoy, and to him it was a real McCoy. His heart was in it, and his soul was in it 100%. Now, in this part of the gym, there was a rope hanging, and one time as I walked through the gym, for some reason or other, I saw that Jim Dean just shinnying up that rope like a monkey, just going right up. And Mr. Absher is pointing out that when Jim Dean was on the stage and swung on the rope out in, remember that East of Eden scene? So it was no difficulty for him to play like a monkey and be on the rope bit. There is another memory I have of this gymnasium. Peg, I don't suppose you were even born yet, but anyhow, Jim was, you may have been a little girl by then, because he came back. Every time he came back, he always came up to see me, of course. And then he wanted to know what I was directing. Well, they were repairing and decorating the gymnasium, the auditorium, so we had to have our theater in the round down here for this one junior play. And I know Judy Six was in it, and Nadine Lawson. They were two of the members. And Jim, of course, he had to come through this door here, and the bleachers were along the side, and we directed the play just about where the hall is, I expect, right in there. But he had a big time directing that, but that's not nearly the story I have to tell when we get to the auditorium, when he really came back about a year later and took over the directing of a play. In fact, the last time he was here, he says, "What you doing, Mrs. Nall, now?" And just happened that the last time he was here was Dennis Stock. We weren't doing any play at that time, so he didn't get to come in and help direct. But anything I could do to help him, I tried to do, which I've tried to do with all of my former pupils, I hope. And evidently I've been successful, because Peg Gann is a mighty successful teacher. This was your room where you had Jim in the ag and whatever. And it's so nice that you can be back in your neighborhood, too. And I see you have your rock lasso. You're going to demonstrate that for us, too?
Oh, I'd like to. This, of course, was developed because of Jimmy and his work in Giant. That's where the idea came from. And of course, this room was the biology, and this was not developed until after a while. But you saw him do that in Giant, and we have 2 contests with the rock lasso.
Very good.
Now this room, of course, if you the ledge that's on the far side is where Jimmy had his soil exhibit set up on top there for a long time. He was the first one to make and complete a soils project for the 4-H work in Grant County. That is in soils. He, I think, got interested in soils because of the oil well that was drilled just north of the Winslow home. And he did this then in 4-H, outgrowth of biology work also.
This class of 1949 had penny suppers. And I can remember, I think you said, Hugh, that they made $100 at one penny supper. Now, how they ever did that, and that was a lot of money back in 1949. The class of 1949 was the first class to make the trips to New York City and to Washington, D.C. And when I knew they were going to Washington, I said to Jim, "Oh, Jim, I want you to go through the Ford Theater, because that's just been restored to a theater now." And he could hardly wait till he came back to tell me, "Mrs. Nall, I got to see," and he got to see where the steps were that James Wilkes Booth fell to the stage. So we'll just bypass the cafeteria, but I had to tell about the penny suppers. And now we shall proceed up the ramp to the math room. This is the old math room, but Larry Wood says it was his chemistry room, didn't he? Nonetheless, Jim Dean had math just about over there where Peg is sitting. And I can remember coming back in 1956 when I'd been in New York, and I came back to visit the school, and the teacher who had had him as a freshman in this room had been returned to Fairmount. And so I asked if she remembered Jim Dean. See, this was 1956. That was a number of years after Jim had been gone, 7 to be a fact. And she didn't even remember the boy. And I couldn't understand it. Well, she had a group of precocious students. It was a sharp class, that class of 1949. And she just didn't remember Jim Dean. Well, I'm back home again in room 21, where I spent 30 years of my life, well, almost 30 years. These windows are all replaced. They weren't like this. They weren't as nice as this when I was here. We used to have to wear heavier underwear. But I've got so many beautiful memories of this room. This Peg Richards, remember there used to be a platform. Now the varnish is shown where it is. Used to be a 6-inch platform, and sometimes I'd have my desk here, and other times I'd move the desk down in that area and then let the kids do their performing. One boy came here, and he was a fan. Oh, this was many years ago, and he wanted to know where Jim stood to give his speech. So I moved down a little bit farther to the front of this auditorium, this platform, to where Jim, and he made a footprint painted where Jim stood. This room is where Jim Dean came to the door over there and gave me, I had my first orchid, and he says, "I want that," and I said, "Why?" And he says, "You'll find out at the end of the day," and he took it, and then he made this gorgeous picture of me, which we'll show when we're in the auditorium. He brought it back the next day, or the evening of the same day, and he said, "Mrs. Nall, you'll have this forever." So I've got the picture now. And then this spot is one that has lots of memories for me. I feel as though I want to step down from the platform in this room. I used to trip on it, and the kids just think that was the most fun. Well, one time Jim was making up for Frankenstein. You folks who are fans remember him in Frankenstein. So he was back in this room area making up that awful makeup thing. Oh, it was hard. He was Frankenstein. And stand back, and I had a group of 8th graders, and I said, "Now he's coming out, here comes Frankenstein." And here he came through the door, and Lordy, it was just as if he had really been, well, the star of the show, because he certainly was. And then when I get into the stage, maybe I can show you how he walked out into the audience through the stage with the same sort of thing for Frankenstein. He was going to eat them up. Well, Jim was standing in about this area when he was practicing his reading one time, and when he was in advanced speech class. Largely, it was a small class, largely athletes, And one boy said, Mrs. Nall, you don't do anything with what Jim wants to do. Well, I'm certainly glad that I did that. And Jim was doing his madman story, and he was having such a time, and I didn't like some of the kids' behavior, so I said, I was sitting back in the back of the room, and I stood, and I said, now look, if you kids are prepared to do your assignment, you get up there and perform. Otherwise, please be quiet while Jim is performing. I sat down. In a minute, he started in again, and the kids started to, well, what do they do? Kid him again, or, you know, make some, oh, no. And then Jim came out of character, and he said, all right, you guys, if you can't take it any better than that, you perform yourself, etc. Well, that was all. So that, he copied me on that. So I sat down, and he finished. We were really saved by the bell. So the boys met over here by the door. They met over here by the door, and some wisecrack was made, and my goodness, they didn't hit in my room, thank goodness, but they got out on the ledge, and then they went down the steps, and by the time they got to the bottom of the steps, the principal was there. Jim was expelled for 3 days, and that was a really sad experience for him. But, c'est la vie, that's the way it goes, and maybe those experiences aren't too bad to take to prepare you for life, as he had many, many such heartaches in his life. Oh, Bill Bast and Dizzy, their friend who lived with them in New York City, came in with Jim early when Jim was in New York. He came up here, of course, and I turned the class over to them, and we took the desk. It was off the stage, and she demonstrated her modern dance, and the boys put on a skit. Then I must tell you that the corner right over there in that area is where Jim would come after school. Whenever he'd come back to Fairmount, he'd always come up here to see me, and he'd stand back there, and sometimes after school was out, that is, at the close of the day, or maybe he'd light up a cigarette, and I'd say, Jim, you can't do that. And then he impudently said, would you like one? I've read where he offered me a cigarette in class. Well, he never did that. He was a very respectful boy to me, and really to most people, I think, unless they tried his patience too much. But that was his corner, and that will always remain in my memory as Jim Dean's corner. But there's another story. When he was a sophomore, he took Spanish, and he was sitting in a seat just about like this. Of course, these are not the chairs we had regular desks. And his eyes got tired, so he had to rest his eyes. And I came along, and I tapped him on the shoulder. I said, Jim, sit up. What if Mr. Gilly would come into the room? Well, that's about the only thing I remember of him in that Spanish class. He didn't care too much about Spanish, but when he went to New York, when he went to Hollywood, he said, Mrs. Nall, I'm going to go. He wanted to know where he should go to school, and I tried to get him to go to Northwestern. No. And doesn't matter, but I said, Jim, if you send me your picture from Hollywood, I will see that it always hangs above my door. And it did, until kids started putting mustaches on pictures and so forth, so that took that down. But on the picture it says Felicidades, which means greetings in Spanish. So he had taken Spanish at Santa Monica Junior College, and he did not completely ignore his Spanish. And our time is so limited, but it's such a precious memory to be here that I think now we're going to go to the auditorium and spend the remaining of our time in this precious auditorium where I spent so many years of my life. This is unbelievable to be in this auditorium with these very precious people, friends of ours. Two former students who were leads in every play I had that when they were in school, and of course Hugh Call with his lasso. I told you in the other room that Jim came in and when I had the orchid on, it was after the junior play, which we did here, and Jim presented to me my first orchid just about here in this part of the stage. And I said, Jim, this is my first orchid, so of course I got a kiss, which was pretty nice, wasn't it? Then the next morning he came to the door when I was having class in the other room there, and he said, I want that. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, never mind, you'll get it back at the end of the day. So this is what he came with at the end of the day. And he didn't even put his name on it, Jim Dean, but he put her pride. Rather typical of Jim. This is the memorabilia that was prepared by Kent Williams, who was a real fan and once a roommate of Jim Dean's in New York City. And I know that he was instrumental in founding the James Dean Foundation in New York City. Now on the wall, when we pan past the spot over there on the wall, is where the award to Jim Dean for when he did not get the Oscar, and Kent thought he should have it. So he wrote this, had them made up, and then he had an Oscar standing, and it's in the museum now. But this type of thing is what he says. Within these, dare I take this off, I hope? Very carefully. Within these walls, James Dean, while still a student, took the first public steps of his magnificent ascent to the very summit of one of life's highest mountains. Within a brief time, he had found there not only a place of immortality for himself, but new horizons for his art, his country, his native city as well, which is mighty precious. And then there is the spot over on the other wall where the plaque was one time presented. I hope I don't drop this. You want to help me with this? Just lay it on the table, thank you. Over on that side of the wall, that Martin Sheen had, of course he says fans, or friends, and, let me see, family, friends, and fans, but it was Martin Sheen's contribution. And he, too, gave credit to this famous auditorium, which was the cultural place for Jim Dean, the beginning of his great talent, as well as Peg and Richards. And Larry, I hope you're still using your drama. I'm sure you are. You're living every day, aren't you? And Phil Jones was another famous public speaker, and he stood just about here, I can remember, in the robe. I have memories of every single play I ever did, and I can see you with Linda Ramsey standing back there receiving some sort of an award when we were, after I'd come back from New York, wasn't it? When did you graduate?
56.
1956, so that was the year I came, no. It was before I left then. I left in 55 to 57. Well, now I've shown you the orchid, and I've told about Jim's disturbance in class, and I think I pretty well have made up what I wanted to do in my room, and now we're in the auditorium. Oh, Jim asked me, I told you down in the cafeteria, could I plan for him, make arrangements for him to do an hour's convocation. Well, I went down to Mr. DuBois, and Mr. DuBois says, the principal, he says, do you think he can do it? I said, Mr. DuBois, Jim wouldn't ask if he didn't think he could do it. Now, he had been in Hollywood about a year, and it was before he had risen any heights at all, but he had been around a little bit and had seen some performing. I'm sure that he felt confident that he could give an auditorium program. So sure enough, we gave him a program. We gave him time to do his program. And I remember I was sitting about the third seat in front, and Jim started down here in the pit. And he loved it. He walked right straight up that aisle, talking to this room full of kids, and how he loved it, just mastering every bit of it. And he turned to me and he says, why in the world didn't you teach us any Shakespeare? Well, I didn't yell out, but I had a notion to say, well, why didn't it take? Because they have Romeo and Juliet in the freshman year, you have Julius Caesar in the second year, and I'm not sure what other, but you have Shakespeare, but he wasn't quite ready for it. But it took him time to get away. And one of our dear friends who is here, Tom Burkhouse, is telling us that, I got his name wrong, Burke Hughes, that The Little Prince is a selection that Jim Dean loved to read. And he and Bill Gann in New York City would sit and night after night read portions of The Little Prince, which is so unusual for a boy to be interested in, an athlete and so forth. But that was Jim. He had so many, many talents. Well, Mrs. Gilbreth was in room 4, and she had a citizenship class. And the freshmen, I think you were maybe one time in that group, and they wrote freshman plays. Did you ever do that? And I had to go down and lecture to them about drama and so forth and what's necessary in a good play and so forth. And then I got to choose the plays, and I think we did 3 freshman plays. Well, of course, Jim starred in his play, and he helped direct the others, and that was his first beginning as a director. But then the freshman play, then his sophomore plays, he said, Mrs. Nall, I know you like to do drama. And I'm going to be on the play choosing committee, so we'll do some drama. He chose from the Dramatist Play Service, I think it's called, Mooncalf Mugford. And I wanted to sit where you are, Larry. We'll change chairs. And I can remember Jim over here. He was the one-arm sailor boy in The Monkey's Paw. I first mentioned Mooncalf Mugford. That was his sophomore play. From this spot, Jim Dean sat as the one-armed sailor boy who had the Monkey's Paw, if you know that one-act play, a very dramatic play. And I remember him sitting here, and he threw it in it was a horrible thing to have it. Somebody would die if they had that in their possession. So he threw it into the fireplace, this very fireplace. It wasn't quite as gawky or as busy as this one is. But that was Jim. And then the girl was Wilda Hayes. You remember her, Wilda Hayes? And bless her heart, she wanted it so much, so she scuffled in there and she got it out. Well, that was a Thespian play. At that time, I probably was a state director of the Thespian Society, and Jim won the first sophomore to win Thespian membership because of his performing in the 2 shows. I've never mentioned David Nall yet, have I? You know who David Nall is, don't you, Hugh?
I've seen David Nall.
David Nall was 2 years younger than Jim, and Jim was very, very kind to David Nall. David Nall was 6'3", and Jim Dean was 5'8", 9. Well, they've even had him up to 10. Never more than that. And I remember the last time I saw Jim, he said, well, what'd you do to make that kid so big? Well, that's what David inherited. Well, David Nall also won membership as a sophomore. You too didn't you, Peggy, as a sophomore? Thespian membership. I don't know about you, Larry. Were you a thespian? Well, so that is that. And I think I told you that Jim Dean was kicked out of my class, and they had this scuffle on the stairs, and then they go down to the bottom of the stairs, and then he's kicked out of school. And I was just beside myself because the student had come in before I went down to find out what happened. Said, oh, Jim's kicked out of school, and I couldn't believe it, so I ran down to my dear friend Myrtle Gilbreth. She was our principal, and I loved that woman. And she said, oh, don't worry, Adeline. That wasn't Jim Dean. That was Jean Valjean defending his honor. The only irony of that thing is that Jim came back that night. Of course, he couldn't play on the team because he was expelled for 3 days. So he tried to get a ticket. And do you suppose they'd sell him a student ticket? Now, I have read, and I don't remember this part, but I am sure that it would be characteristic of Jim. I don't know whether he did buy a ticket or not, but he's supposed to have ridden his motorcycle out to his folks, remember, out to his mother's grave in Marion. And more or less at that time, what am I supposed to do? You know, I don't know whether that was when he said to do it all on my own or what. But anyhow, it was a pretty cruel thing to do to a sensitive high school senior boy. Not enough to kick him out of school, but no, you're not a student. Oh, so he had some pretty rough times going in his school here, too. Now, when he was a senior, I couldn't do everything. I tried to. I don't think I ever pushed the broom, but I might have. Well, I didn't push the broom as a janitor, but I did lots of other things. So in 1949, I put out the yearbook, I published the Breeze, I did the speech and the drama. Kind of a busy gal. So when it came to directing Thespian, and Jim Dean was not the easiest boy always for everybody, and he knew how to and get me to do what he wanted him to do, so forth, that sometimes I just thought, well, I've had it. So Mr. Mattingly did the sponsoring of the Thespian troupe that year. And that was really good. And some of you have seen the play, what was that? Goon with the Wind, the picture. And in the center of stage is old tall Dave Nall. And who was Joanne Jones over here? And Jim Dean the villain. Do you remember that picture? It's in many of the books. He was a great, great boy and a great actor. Well, on the door over there is the signature of Martin Sheen. He said, Fairmount, I love you, when he was here in September the 30th, 1980. So we cherish that. I also wanted to call attention to this, whatever you call it, pedestal thing, where the bust of Jim Dean was. I don't suppose you were ever guilty of putting a cigarette in his mouth because you didn't smoke, because you were an athlete and you couldn't smoke. And I know Peg wouldn't do it. No way. But anyhow, kids would love, look, Mrs. Nall, they say. So I'd crawl out there and get that cigarette and try not to blow my top. One time I came in here and a kid's leg was through the ceiling up there. Oh, what a time. These are just part of the joys of being a school teacher. Jim, I told you, did the program in here, and it was very exciting, and he had a big time doing it. Then after he performed in the aisle, then he came to the stage, and he had gone home and he got his red matador cape. And oh boy, did he love it. I can't do it at all. Can you, Larry, do you know how to? I bet Peg could do it. But anyhow, he'd flash that around, and I'll never forget the boy. I won't tell you his name because I think he's embarrassed about it, but he had a broomstick handle, and he charged through as the bull, and Jim would flash that cape. It was so, you remember that, Hugh?
I sure did.
That was a really, really exciting time. So Jim not only kept us the one period, but he ran over at least another half period, so it was pretty exciting. Oh, during Jim's senior year, he had given so much thought to his athletics up until his senior year, and he was beginning to kind of take, of course, I can't take too much credit because his encouragement came from his grandparents and his mother and all. He was a boy that was very, very loved. And yet, when he was in my advanced speech class, he decided that he wanted to have a dressing room. So backstage, there's a little tiny strip, not more than 3 feet wide, I'm sure, but it goes back about 7 or 8 feet. And he put a mirror in there, and on the door he put a star and his name. But of course, kids couldn't keep that on there, so they painted over it, I suppose. But nonetheless, that's a precious spot to me because Jim Dean thought he was a star then. Well, now let's see. Oh, and his junior play he did up here, Our Hearts Were Young and Gay. And he came into the class one day and he said, Mrs. Nall, I want to work on the stage. I've got to make a porthole for that set. Well, that's all right, but I've never found the flat. I don't see any flats got a hole in it. But anyhow, he went to the art department, which was just across the hall from my room. 21 was 22, and that's where he was in art. He gets a razor blade and cuts out a porthole. Well, I about had a fit. Jim, well, you had to have a practical one. But, oh, what fun. He had as much fun in the production like he did in his ag work and his soil collection and so forth as he did in doing the production of a show. And the junior play, do you remember, or no, it was a senior play, Our Hearts Were Young and Gay. And he's standing just about down here, and I'm over here, and up on the platform back of me here was where Earl Vedder was the discus thrower. If you remember, You Can't Take It With You, that great play. And so I turned it over to Jim. We didn't have time. We couldn't take our pictures in our costumes because the set wasn't even up yet. But I said, you go ahead, Jim, and set the stage and tell us when. And so he came into my room and said, we're all set. He had the cast here on the stage. And then I was down there, and he told me to go ahead and show how to throw the discus. So you see my back in that picture of the annual, if you've ever seen it. And that was great fun. I tried to let all my pupils have as much leeway as they could take. And Melba Miller and Lola, I said, weren't you in the play that Jim directed? Yes. Silly thing, it was called Men Are Like Streetcars. But she remembered it. And how well I remember, that was the play I was directing, so I turned it over to him. He wanted to direct it. Good enough. And I'll always remember, I was sitting down in the audience, had Mr. and Mrs. Winslow, so they could come and watch him in action, sitting down there, and he was standing here, posing. Well, I don't think I can get there right now, but watching. And then he'd talk to him. He'd come up and talk to him confidentially. I don't know how you direct, Peg, but that's the way he directed. That's the way he had been doing, you know. And then he'd go back and watch him. And what a thrill. Kitty Ann Smith, I think, was in that play, too. Great life. Great, great, great memories, and great memories for 30 years of my life. I guess I got that taken care of, haven't I? So, I think that night, I always kept kids about 9:30 for rehearsal. I wouldn't want to keep you too long because you'd have basketball and then you have to come up here and so forth. So, my goodness, in the middle of my name was Brookshire at one time. I married an Ed Brookshire. In fact, I said to Jim once, how come you're not giving me any publicity? He said, what's your name? See, he knew me as Mrs. Brookshire, not Mrs. Nall. So Ed Brookshire came in here and he says, hey, the parents are calling me, wanting to know where their kids are. Here it was, nearly midnight, and they were still at rehearsal. And they hadn't even got through Act 1. But he had a big time directing that play. And the last time he was here, he wanted to know what play I was doing because he would have come and helped. And I think this does the whole thing. But it's really quite an experience, and I'm so grateful to you, Tom, to you, Diane, to you, Alan, and to you, Maxine Rowland, and all of us for having known Jim Dean and for knowing each other and for having still a thrill with our life. And I sure appreciate you people being here.
Adeline, you told me once that you had Jim for 6 years.
That's right.
That would be through the...
7th, 8th, and then 4 years of high school.
Excellent. Do you remember the occasion when you first met him? Very first reminiscence of him.
Well, the first that I remember is when he came to me, I don't know whether he came to my room or in the hall, but I coached him in his WCDU contest piece, bars. So yes, but the only time I had was at noon. So we met downstairs at noon, and I coached him in that little reading. Mm-hmm.
And he came to see you on some of his trips back here from New York City?
He came every time except the very last time, which is why I'm sitting in this seat. I sat in this seat watching the Wabash College Glee Club perform, thinking Jim Dean would surely pop in because David Nall was giving his reading of all the people. See, he was a freshman, well, he was a Wabash anyhow. And no Jim, I just died. But that's the only time. Other than that, he always came back to see me. Mm-hmm.
Did he ever visit you out on the farm, at home?
Oh, yes. When he did the Madman story, he and David Nall, he and Hortense Winslow came over to my house. And I guess he drove, can't remember, I'm sure he did, and not Hortense. And we drove to Peru. David Nall was at Purdue. in the FFA speech contest with Mr. Callhall. And Jim Dean and I and Hortense drove to Peru, Indiana for the National Forensic League speech meet. And Jim got 2 first places. So we got to go back the next day. Well, he knew David would be coming home, so he and Hortense waited around my house until David came in. And we could hear David laying on the horn. Call, of course, we never thought to reminisce about this with him here. And, of course, as soon as Jim heard that, out the front door he went, down all those steps, just hopped down, you know. And, of course, David jumped out of the car, I won! And those guys threw their arms around each other, you know how kids are. And darn, Jim was so sweet. I didn't tell you that out here on this landing is where Jim Dean and David Nall used to have their duo. We brought, what are those? Well, they're foils, you know, we bought them for Thespian. And so Jim was very considerate of David Nall. So then the next day, David and Jim and I drove to Peru, and that's when Jim placed first in the state meet. Okay.
I understand there's a story behind the ring on your right hand.
Oh, yes. When he was here with Dennis Stock that time, and he didn't show up here with me, and I thought, well, the Monday, and I sat in this chair, this seat right here, and I thought, well, who am I? So I didn't go about, I don't think I went to the house. Maybe I did. Anyhow, later on, Dennis, we were down at his granddad's house. It was about Wednesday. And Dennis was behind him taking pictures of me, but he never took pictures of the 2 of us. You see, I was facing Jim, and Jim got the biggest kick because in his wristwatch, he had a little wire recorder. And that tickled him to death because you don't know what I'm doing. So he taped my voice, you know, because that was fun. And then he said to Dennis Stock, dig that ring. Then I retired. The teachers at Madison Grant gave me this black opal, which is pretty. And of course, I'm a Leo. You wouldn't guess, but I'm a Leo. But I did want to get that dual bit because I'd have to wait. See, David was only a sophomore. Although he was tall, he still couldn't play basketball. He had a bad foot. And what's Mr. Weaver's name? Paul Weaver was his coach. In fact, I've often said to Paul that Paul Weaver and I had as much to do with Jim Dean as any of the other teachers in school because he loved his athletics. Oh, loving athletics. When we came back on our way back from Peru, after he'd known he'd won the state, he said, gee, I wish I had known when I was a sophomore what I know now about speech. I would have had more of Jim Dean, but everything's athletics. Like, well, Larry can answer that. Larry Wood, you know, all athletics. He didn't do anything much in speech. I suppose he took sophomore speech, and that was it. But I never will forget that Jim said that if he had known what he'd known, what he knew, the value of reaching out to an audience. And then when we went to Longmont, Colorado, you see, when he won the national, or won the state, that entitled us to go to the national meet. So Marcus got busy and they raised $85. Well, that wasn't near enough, but that helped on our train fare. We went to Chicago, and all this is going to be in my book, I hope. And took the Denver Zephyr to Denver, Colorado, and then we went up to Longmont, Colorado for the meet. And that is where I tried to tell Jim, look, kid, you are in the cream of the crop. Because National Forensic League, if you don't know it, it is the top speech group of the country. Oh my goodness, stories like everything.
Well, you're promising the world a book right now then, aren't you?
Well, I've been promising it since I was in New York. But you know, I couldn't write a book in New York in 55 and 6 and 7. I felt that people that did all this were exploiting Jim Dean, and I felt he would have felt they were exploiting him. See, they didn't know enough about him, really, and all they had was this Hollywood stuff, and he was portrayed as a pretty lousy kid.
I remember the article in Life magazine was entitled Moody New Star.
Yeah.
Negative in a way.
Right. No, but he would do this to attract attention. In fact, he said to me once, he'd rather have them talk adversely about him than not to be talking at all. And he'd do the dumbest things. If I could have got him, I'd say, don't do that, Jim, but shoot. He got by with it, I guess. But too much publicity was rather poor. What do you think about the whole thing?
About the publicity, or just, what, I mean, particularly?
I'm just trying to get you to talk. Make a speech.
Well, I got some questions I wanted to ask you.
All right, what?
Now's the time.
One, I've always wondered, what it would be like to run around with and be associated real close with somebody that turned out to be a legend like James Dean. And I just wondered, like the kids that went to school with him and you, I mean, I know you had close relationship, but as far as teaching him his drama in school and all, but I just wonder how it makes you feel to know that somebody like him that went on to be a legend and always will be, and he'll be remembered, I think, for years and years to come. And I just wonder, deep down inside, how does that really make you feel?
I'm awestruck. I really am awesome about the whole thing. I feel very humble that I even knew the boy. And I wasn't sure what he would do with me. In fact, in New York City, I was a little bit hesitant, even though he had told me to go to New York. I said, how do you know I can act? He said, I've seen you teach, big time. But I didn't tell you the story in that room in there, my classroom, when he was back once sitting at the desk when he was up on that platform. And I was just letting him talk to the kids, which I always do if a kid comes back to school. Any number of kids that come back from the Army, well, I'd let him come. Well, he didn't come from the Army, but let him take my desk. So the sun was coming in that window, and I pulled the blinds on, and he said, sit down. Just about like that. Boy, did I sit down. And I felt the power that that boy was beginning to feel even then, see. So in New York, I wasn't sure what he would do with me. I wasn't sure. He might even pass me on the street. Well, Jane Dacey said, no, he won't do that. So she had flown to California to make out a new contract for him. And he met her at the plane, drove into L.A. with her, and she tells me that they got to talking about me and that I was a little bit hurt, a little bit sensitive. And we couldn't understand why. I would not infringe on the boy at all, if it would upset him.
Yeah.
But gosh, he was so darn sweet too. Even the last time when he didn't come here, I kind of scolded him. I said, why don't you come up, Jim? I expected you. Well, they had to go to Marion to hunt some wire recorder, like for his crazy little mic, or something that Dennis stocked. Well, I don't know whether he hadn't outgrown the place. People have said that he'd never come back to Fairmount. Well, they don't know. Hortense Winslow, he loved that woman.
Oh.
He loved Marcus. He loved all of them. But I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Yeah.
I stand in awe of the boy, too. I really do.
To us, to me, meeting you and the ones that knew him, I stand in awe of that because I feel that you're a celebrity too for knowing him.
Well, that's precious of you to say so, and it's kind of a handicap too. Do you know? It really is to me because I should and could have been doing things, although I've not done so poorly even since I've been retired. See, I've been retired from teaching for 14 years, for crying out loud, and I only taught 30 here. But I got credit. See, I taught in Chicago too before, and Jim got the benefit of all of that. One time that I said to professor of Purdue University, P.E. Lull, we were headed out to the National Speech Meet, Speech Association of America. And we were sitting up in the train at night, and I made the dumb statement that I love to rub shoulders with prominent people with big wheels. You know, that was the craziest thing to say, you know, a lot of people. But I meant it, and it was fun.
Yeah, it would be.
But some I've read recently that he had the desire to have his memory live on, like in his footprints and his handprints. Well, I'm sure you've got your things from the past. I think that's why my house is such a collection of memorabilia.
Yeah, we've all got
treasures. Yes.
Yeah. Treasures.
And that maybe someday somebody will think, gee, they were a pretty great person or some such thing, you know.
Yeah.
Well, James Dean did all right.
He did all right.
And you have played a great role in that. And speaking on behalf of many fans, many places, we want to thank you, because you said outside when we taped outside that you thought that this whole thing was coming off because of me. And I shook my hand at you like that, and I said, no, the whole thing is coming off, Adeline, because of you.
That's precious.
Thank you very much. It's no accident that I gave you an orchid on behalf of the We Remember Dean International Fan Club. It was on purpose because it's an orchid. It's not your first one. And I pray to heavens that it won't be your last.
Well, I hope it isn't.
I thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to thank our guests. I'd like to thank the production company from Family Home Video in Marion, Indiana. Appreciate it very much, guys. You did a beautiful job. And now I'm just rambling on and on. If you think this is going to get in the tape, I got news for you. Now I'm going to chop this right out.